Nicole Brooks heard the wax seal crack and felt her stomach drop. She'd only entered the records chamber to retrieve a misplaced contract for her employer, Mr. Pemberton, who was too drunk on port to remember where he'd left it. The basement of Lincoln's Inn was supposed to be empty at this hour, the senior barristers long gone to their suppers and mistresses. She should have grabbed the document and left. Instead, she'd followed the sound of that distinctive snap, the breaking of a ducal seal. Her candle flickered as she peered around the corner of a filing cabinet. Two men stood hunched over a desk in the shadows, their backs to her. One wore the livery of a court messenger. The other she recognized from the cut of his coat, Lord Vane's clerk. "The forgery's perfect," the clerk whispered, sliding a parchment across the desk. "His Grace's seal, his signature. When this land deed surfaces tomorrow, the Duke of Houghton will be summoned for treason before week's end." Nicole's breath caught. The Houghton succession. The rumors had been circling the courts for months, whispers of contested lands, of titles built on fraud. But this wasn't discovery. This was fabrication. She should leave, should slip back into the darkness and pretend she'd seen nothing. But then came the third sound, heavy boots on the stone stairs leading down to the chamber. "Bailiffs," the messenger hissed. "They're early. The warrant's already been signed." The panic in his voice made Nicole's decision for her. She stepped into the light. Both men whirled toward her with identical expressions of shock. The forged deed lay between them, still wet with ink, the Houghton seal pressed in crimson wax beside it. "I can hear at least 3 sets of boots," Nicole said calmly, though her pulse hammered in her throat. "You have approximately 45 seconds before they reach this chamber and find you both here with that forgery." The clerk's face went white. "Oh, God! If Vane discovers we were caught!" "Not necessarily." Nicole's mind raced through possibilities, discarding each as it formed. Her gaze snagged on the seal press still sitting on the desk, the Houghton crest gleaming in the candlelight. Beautiful work, expensive, likely stolen from the Duke's own study. She stepped fully into the room and set down her candle. "I need that deed now." Lord Vane's clerk finally found his voice. "What?" "The deed, the seal, the press, give them to me." Nicole was already reaching for the document, her fingers assessing the ink, still wet enough to smudge. "Quickly!" The messenger's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" His voice had turned cold, calculating. He was frightened, but he was also clearly intelligent enough to recognize leverage when he saw it. Nicole met his gaze and smiled. "We'll discuss terms after I save you. Right now, I need you both to run. Use the east stairwell. Tell anyone who asks you were inventorying the archives in the north wing." She was already moving, gathering the forged documents, the seal, the press, evidence of a conspiracy that would hang them all. "When they question you tomorrow, you'll say you saw a clerk working late. Young woman, brown hair, unfamiliar. You assumed she had authorization." "Your what?" the clerk sputtered. "I'm now the only person who can testify the Duke of Houghton never forged anything." Nicole's hands moved with surgical precision as she folded the parchment into her bodice, pocketed the seal. "Unless you'd prefer the alternative, where the King's bailiffs find you both holding forged treason evidence and ask why Lord Vane wanted the Duke destroyed." The boots were louder now. Voices echoed down the corridor. "Go!" Nicole commanded. They went. She heard them scramble up the east stairs just as lamplight spilled into the chamber. Nicole didn't look up from the filing cabinet where she now stood, her expression serene, her hands steady on a perfectly legitimate contract, as if working alone in basement archives at midnight was perfectly ordinary. 3 bailiffs entered, the King's warrant-bearer at their head. "The Duke of Houghton's records. We've come to seize evidence of—" "I'm afraid you'll find the records in perfect order," Nicole said mildly, turning to face them. She kept the candle between her and the bailiffs, casting her face in shadow. "Though I should mention His Grace's personal study would be a more appropriate place to execute a warrant of this nature. These are merely copies." The warrant-bearer's eyes narrowed. "And you are?"
"A clerk. I was asked to verify some documents before morning." She gestured vaguely toward the cabinet. "Though if you'd like to wait until Mr. Pemberton arrives, I'm certain he can authorize your access to—" "We don't need authorization." He thrust the warrant forward. "By order of His Majesty, we're to collect all materials related to the Houghton land patents and deliver them to the Lord Chancellor's office for examination." Nicole read the warrant slowly, buying time as her mind spun. The forgery was pressed against her ribs, the seal heavy in her pocket. If they searched her, she'd hang alongside the Duke. But they wouldn't search her. She was beneath their notice, a woman, a clerk, invisible. "The Houghton materials are in the north wing," she said. "I can show you." She led them on a deliberately circuitous route through the archives, giving the two conspirators time to vanish into the London night. By the time the bailiffs realized the most damning evidence, the forged deed they'd been sent to discover, was nowhere to be found, Nicole was already planning her next move. The Duke of Houghton's life had just been saved by a woman he'd never met. And now she owned him.
Nicole Brooks had spent her life in the shadows of London's legal machinery, a woman with the mind of a king's counsel, but the status of a copying clerk. She could recite Blackstone's commentaries from memory, could spot a fraudulent contract at 20 paces, could argue circles around the barristers who paid her 6 pence to transcribe their fumbling arguments. None of it mattered. The law was a gentleman's profession, and she would never be a gentleman. When she discovered the plot to frame Duke Alex Houghton, she didn't act out of altruism or justice or any of the noble principles the courts pretended to uphold. She acted out of a hunger for the power she'd been denied her entire life. With 45 seconds to spare, she'd stolen a conspiracy and made it her currency. Now, as dawn broke over London, Nicole stood in the entry hall of Houghton House with the forged deed and ducal seal wrapped in her cloak. She'd sent word ahead. "Urgent matter regarding your family's legal interests. Come alone." The butler's response had been terse. "My study, 6 o'clock." The butler who admitted her looked scandalized that a woman of her station had been granted an audience. The housekeeper whispered behind her hand. Nicole ignored them both. She'd spent her life being overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. That ended today. The Duke's study was exactly what she'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling law books, mahogany furniture that cost more than she'd earn in a lifetime, and a man who looked like he'd been carved from ice and aristocratic certainty. Duke Alex Houghton stood behind his desk, tall and rigid, his dark hair immaculate, his grey eyes assessing her with the kind of cold precision usually reserved for balance sheets and breeding stock. "You have 3 minutes to explain why you've wasted my time," he said. Nicole set the forged deed on his desk. He stared at it, at the broken seal, at his own signature, perfectly duplicated in another man's hand. "This was to be discovered in the Lincoln's Inn archives this morning. By noon you would have been summoned before the Lord Chancellor to answer charges of treason. By week's end you'd be standing trial for forging land patents to secure your family's title." The Duke's face remained impassive, but she saw his fingers tighten on the edge of the desk. "Who sent you?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "No one sent me. I intercepted this myself. The bailiffs who came to seize it found nothing." She paused, letting that sink in. "Because I took it first." "Why?" "Because I want something you have, Your Grace, and now you're going to give it to me." For the first time, something flickered in those cold grey eyes. Not fear, men like him didn't know how to be afraid, but recognition. He understood exactly what was happening. "What do you want?" He bit off each word. "Money? A reference? Safe passage out of London?" Nicole smiled. "I want a position as your primary legal counsel and estate manager. I want an office in this house, access to your files, and the authority to act on your behalf in all legal matters. I want a salary that reflects my value, a title that opens doors, and your public endorsement as the most brilliant legal mind you've ever employed." That's insane. You're a woman. You're—" He gestured vaguely at her worn dress, her ink-stained fingers. "A clerk." "I was a clerk. Now I'm the only person standing between you and the gallows." Nicole pulled the seal from her pocket and set it beside the forged deed. "This is your family seal, stolen from this very study. The man who orchestrated this forgery is Lord Vane, and he won't stop with one attempt. He wants your title, Your Grace. He wants your lands, and he has the connections and the malice to destroy you, unless someone with actual legal brilliance protects you." She leaned forward, holding his gaze. "I am that someone, and you will accept my terms, or I will walk out of here with the only evidence that proves you're innocent. By tomorrow, the story will be that the Duke of Houghton destroyed the forgery himself to hide his guilt." The silence stretched between them like a blade. Finally, Alex Houghton spoke, his voice laced with contempt and something else, something that might have been reluctant respect. "You've blackmailed your way into my employ. Congratulations, Miss Brooks. I hope you survived the experience." "I plan to, Your Grace." Nicole gathered the evidence and tucked it back into her cloak. "I'll move into the estate by week's end. I trust you'll inform your staff that I'm to be treated with the deference my position demands." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Your Grace, I'll need a seat at tonight's dinner. Lord Vane will be there, I assume. It's time he met the woman who just became his greatest problem." The Duke said nothing, but as Nicole walked out of Houghton House into the grey London morning, she felt the weight of his gaze on her back, sharp, suspicious, and trapped. She'd saved his life. Now he belonged to her, and she was just getting started. The Duke's silence was a living thing, cold and coiled and venomous. He hadn't moved from behind his desk for the past 10 minutes, his grey eyes fixed on Nicole with the kind of intensity usually reserved for enemies on a battlefield. She met his gaze without flinching, standing in the center of his study as dawn light crept through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes and the chasm of power between them. Or rather, what used to be a chasm. "These are my terms," Nicole said, breaking the silence. She pulled a folded document from her cloak and set it on his desk beside the forged deed. "I've taken the liberty of drafting a contract. You'll find it quite thorough." Alex picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it might contaminate him. His jaw tightened as he read. "An annual salary of £200, private chambers in the East Wing, access to all estate records, financial accounts, and legal correspondence." He looked up, his voice dripping ice. "Use of the ducal carriage for business purposes." "I'll need mobility if I'm to protect your interests across London," Nicole said reasonably. "You'll need—" He set the contract down with barely restrained violence. "Miss Brooks, you seem to be under the impression that you've won something here. Allow me to clarify. You are a blackmailer, a criminal who has stolen evidence and is now extorting your way into my household. The moment I find a way to extricate myself from this arrangement, you will be gone." "Naturally," Nicole smiled. "Until then, however, you'll sign." The muscle in his jaw jumped. For a moment she thought he might refuse, might throw her out and take his chances with Lord Vane's conspiracy. But then his hand moved, almost imperceptibly, toward the contract. He signed it like a man signing his own death warrant. Satisfied, the word was a whip-crack. "For now." Nicole took the contract, still warm with ink, and folded it carefully. "I'll arrive with my belongings tomorrow morning. Please have Mrs. Hartley prepare the East Wing chambers. Nothing ostentatious. I'm not here to play at being a lady. I need a proper desk, adequate lighting, and proximity to your study for consultations." "Consultations," he repeated flatly. "You'll find I'm an asset, Your Grace, once you overcome your wounded pride."
She turned toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Lord Vane will undoubtedly hear that his plan failed. He'll come sniffing around, looking for weaknesses. When he does, you'll introduce me as your new legal advisor, a distant cousin from your mother's side, recently returned from the continent, brilliant but eccentric. It will explain my gender and my sudden presence. I don't have any cousins on my mother's side. You do now." Nicole pulled on her gloves. "I suggest you memorize the details. I'll have a full background prepared for you by tomorrow evening. In the meantime, Your Grace, do try not to look so miserable. We've just begun what I'm sure will be a long and mutually beneficial partnership." She left him standing in his study, surrounded by the law books and inherited wealth that were supposed to make him untouchable, now bound to a woman's whose ink-stained fingers had just rewritten the rules of his entire existence. The staff's reaction the next morning was everything Nicole had anticipated, and worse. Mrs. Hartley, the head housekeeper, stood in the entrance hall with her arms crossed and her mouth pressed into a line so thin it had nearly disappeared. Behind her, 3 maids whispered behind their hands, while a footman pretended to polish a mirror that was already gleaming. The butler, Graves, looked as though someone had informed him the house was now infested with plague rats.
"The Duke has instructed me to prepare the east wing for you," Mrs. Hartley said, each word coated in frost. She looked Nicole up and down, taking in her simple traveling dress, her single worn trunk, the portfolio of legal documents tucked under her arm. "Miss Brooks, is it?" "It is." Nicole stepped fully into the hall, refusing to be cowed by the housekeeper's glacial disapproval. "I trust the chambers are ready." "They are." Mrs. Hartley turned on her heel. "Though I must say, in all my years serving the Houghton family, I have never seen such irregular arrangements. A woman living here unchaperoned, claiming to be some manner of legal adviser." "I don't claim to be, Mrs. Hartley, I am." Nicole followed her up the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing on marble that cost more than her entire childhood home. "And I'll thank you to remember that I'm here at His Grace's express invitation and employment. My position in this household is not subject to your approval." The housekeeper's spine went rigid, but she said nothing more. The East Wing chambers were beautiful in the way that old money always was, understated, elegant, and completely impractical for someone who needed to work. The sitting room had cream silk wallpaper and furniture that looked too delicate to actually sit on. The bedroom beyond was dominated by a canopied bed that could sleep 4 people comfortably. "Where's the desk?" Nicole asked. Mrs. Hartley blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The desk for working. I specified adequate workspace and lighting." Nicole set down her trunk and moved to the window, assessing the light. "This room faces south, which is ideal, but I'll need a proper writing desk, not that decorative monstrosity." She pointed at a spindly-legged table that looked like it would collapse under the weight of a single law book. "I'll see what can be arranged." Mrs. Hartley's voice had gone from frost to permafrost. "Today, please." Nicole turned back to her. "I have work to begin immediately. And, Mrs. Hartley, I'll take my meals in my chambers for now. I have no interest in enduring the staff's resentment over breakfast." The housekeeper's eyes flashed. "The staff, Miss Brooks, are simply unused to irregular situations." "Then they'll have to become accustomed." Nicole opened her portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents, dismissing the woman as effectively as any duchess. "That will be all." The housekeeper left in a rustle of scandalized skirts. Nicole stood alone in her new chambers, surrounded by silk and silver and the kind of luxury she'd spent her entire life watching from the outside. She moved to the window and looked down at the manicured gardens below, at the estate that now, in some strange way, belonged to her as much as it belonged to the Duke, who hated her. She'd done it.
leveraged 45 seconds of quick thinking into a position of real power, real influence. The staff might despise her, the Duke might be counting the days until he could rid himself of her, but she was here, in Houghton House, with a contract that bore a ducal signature and gave her access to everything she'd ever been denied. Nicole Brooks was no longer a shadow in the corners of other people's ambitions, and she had no intention of ever going back.
Alex Houghton had spent 3 days trying to find the crack in Nicole Brooks's armor, and it was driving him to distraction. He'd dealt with opportunists before. London was full of them, social climbers, fortune hunters, parasites who attached themselves to titles and wealth with the tenacity of barnacles. They all had a price, they always did. The trick was finding it quickly enough to minimize the damage. But Miss Brooks wasn't behaving like any opportunist he'd ever encountered. She'd settled into the East Wing with the efficiency of a general establishing a forward position. Within 2 days, she'd converted the sitting room into something resembling a legal office, complete with filing systems that would have made the King's own solicitors weep with envy. She took her meals alone, worked until midnight, and had thus far declined every attempt he'd made to engage her in conversation that didn't involve estate business. It was unsettling. On the 4th morning of her residence, Alex decided to change tactics. He found her in what she'd commandeered as her workspace, surrounded by ledgers and documents, her dark hair pinned back in a style that was ruthlessly practical rather than fashionable. She didn't look up when he entered. "Miss Brooks." "Your Grace." She made a notation in a ledger, her pen scratching across the page with precise strokes. "If this is about the Chesterfield contract, I've already drafted revisions. The original terms were laughably favorable to the tenant." "It's not about Chesterfield." Alex closed the door behind him. "I'd like to discuss your compensation." That got her attention. She set down her pen and looked at him with those sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully maintained composure. "My compensation is outlined in the contract you signed." £200 annually. Alex moved further into the room, his hands clasped behind him. "It's a respectable sum for someone of your former position, but hardly adequate for someone with your evident skills." She tilted her head slightly, like a cat watching a mouse make a predictable move. "Go on." "I'm prepared to offer you £500, plus a recommendation to any law firm in London you choose. My personal endorsement would open doors that would otherwise remain permanently closed to a woman." He paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. "In exchange, you'll return the forged deed and seal, terminate our contract, and leave Houghton House today." The silence that followed was absolute. Nicole simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. "No," she said finally. "I haven't finished. You have, actually." She turned back to her ledger. "The answer is no." Alex felt his carefully controlled temper fray. £1,000 then, and letters of introduction to 3 of the most influential barristers in England, men who could mentor you, who could— "Your Grace." Nicole set down her pen again, this time with a deliberateness that felt like a warning. "I appreciate that you're attempting to— what's the phrase— buy me off, but you're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of what I want. Then enlighten me." He moved to stand directly in front of her desk. "What exactly does someone like you want, if not money?" The words came out more contemptuously than he'd intended, and he saw something flash in her eyes. Not hurt, she was too armored for that, but recognition of the insult and a decision on how to respond to it. "Someone like me," you repeated softly. "A woman, a clerk, someone from the shadows who should be grateful for whatever scraps the aristocracy deigns to throw her way." "That's not what It's exactly what you meant." Nicole stood, coming around the desk to face him directly. They were closer now than they'd been since that first morning in his study, close enough that he could see the determination burning behind her calculated composure.
Your Grace, you think this is about gold, Your Grace, about securing a comfortable life for myself, isn't it?
No, she smiled, and it was the smile of someone holding all the cards. I don't want your money. I can earn money. What I want is something you can't purchase, and you certainly can't give away in a moment of desperation. And what's that? Legitimacy. The word hung between them like a blade. I want to sit in rooms where decisions are made. I want my advice sought by men who would normally never acknowledge my existence. I want to negotiate contracts, manage estates, argue legal precedents, and have those arguments matter. I want the kind of power that comes from being indispensable to someone who actually has influence in this world. She took a step closer, and Alex found himself fighting the urge to step back. You can offer me £1,000, £10,000, and I'd still refuse, because money without position is just a prettier prison. But this? She gestured around the room, at the papers bearing his seal, at the evidence of the work she was already doing. This is real power, the kind that opens doors not because someone gives me a recommendation, but because I've proven I belong there. Alex stared at her, a cold realization settling in his chest. You don't want to leave. I have no intention of leaving. Even though everyone in this house despises you, even though you're dining alone every night like a prisoner. I've been invisible my entire life, Your Grace. Being despised is at least an improvement over being ignored. Her voice was steady, but he heard something beneath it, something harder and hungrier than simple ambition. Besides, I suspect the staff will come around once they realize I'm not going anywhere. And if they don't, then they'll learn to work around me, just as you will. Nicole returned to her desk, settling back into her chair with the ease of someone who had already won. Now, unless you have actual estate business to discuss, I have 17 contracts to review before the end of the week. Your previous solicitor appears to have had the legal acumen of a particularly dim sheep. Alex stood there for a moment longer, studying her. The dismissal was clear, and it rankled in a way he wasn't accustomed to. He was a duke. People didn't dismiss him in his own house. But this woman had just refused an offer that would have made her independently wealthy for life, had rejected the chance to escape a household that treated her with open hostility, all because she wanted something he couldn't simply purchase her way out of. She wanted what he had, not his money, not his title, but his power, his influence, his ability to make things happen with a word or a signature. And the truly unsettling part was that she was right. She was already indispensable. In less than a week, she'd identified problems in his estate management that his previous solicitor had missed for years. She worked with a precision and dedication that bordered on obsessive, and she had no intention of disappearing quietly, no matter how much gold he dangled in front of her. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Nicole looked up, meeting his eyes with that unnerving directness. "Perhaps, but it's my mistake to make, isn't it?" Alex left without another word, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. As he walked back through the corridors of his own estate, he felt the weight of a new and uncomfortable truth settling over him. He couldn't buy her off, he couldn't intimidate her to leaving, and he couldn't find a single legal way to break the contract she'd forced him to sign. Nicole Brooks had outmaneuvered him completely. And the worst part was that somewhere beneath his anger and wounded pride, he was beginning to suspect she might actually be worth keeping around. The library was dark when Alex entered, lit only by the fire crackling in the hearth and a single lamp burning on the massive oak table that dominated the room. Nicole sat surrounded by documents, her face drawn with concentration, shadows pooling beneath her eyes. She'd been at this for hours, judging by the cold tea and abandoned dinner tray beside her. It was past midnight. He'd only come downstairs because he'd seen the light from his chambers and wondered which servant had been careless enough to leave a lamp burning. He should have known. "Miss Brooks," his voice cut through the silence, "the household retires at 11. I suggest you do the same." She didn't look up from the document she was studying. "I'll retire when I've finished." "Finished what, exactly?" Alex moved closer, curiosity overriding his irritation. The table was covered in what appeared to be estate maps, property deeds, and correspondence dating back decades. "What are you doing?" "Working." She made a notation on one of the maps, "though I suppose that's becoming clear." "It's the middle of the night." "Yes, well, some discoveries can't wait until morning." Nicole finally looked up, and there was something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Not triumph, exactly. Something sharper, more dangerous. "Your Grace, I need you to sit down." "I beg your pardon?" "Please." The word sounded like it cost her something to say. "What I'm about to show you requires your full attention, and I'd prefer you weren't standing when you see it." Alex felt his pulse quicken. He'd heard that tone before, from generals delivering news of lost battles, from solicitors explaining that cases were unwinnable. It was the voice of someone about to shatter your understanding of the world. He sat. Nicole pulled 3 documents from the organized chaos in front of her and laid them out in a deliberate sequence. 2 weeks ago, a minor baronet named Sir Edmund Carow purchased a small estate in Yorkshire. Here, she pointed to a location on the map. The property itself is worthless, poor soil, no timber, barely habitable structures. Then why does this concern me? Because of what it borders. Her finger traced a line on the map. Your northern holdings, specifically the tract of land that provides water access to your tenant farms. Alex leaned forward, studying the map more carefully. Carow bought the millwright's property? He did, at twice its market value, paid in full, no mortgage. Nicole slid the second document toward him, a bill of sale, which raises the question of why a man of modest means would pay a premium for worthless land, unless the land itself isn't what he's actually purchasing. "Access," Alex said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "He's bought access to my water rights." "Precisely." Nicole's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "And here's where it becomes interesting. Sir Edmund Carow has no history of land speculation, no involvement in agriculture, no reason whatsoever to care about Yorkshire water access. But do you know who does care?" She pulled out the third document, a corporate charter for something called the Northern Waterworks Company. Alex scanned it, his jaw tightening as he recognized the names of the board members. "Lord Vane," he said flatly. "Lord Vane," Nicole confirmed, "along with 3 other investors, all of whom have been buying up small properties throughout the north for the past 18 months, properties that individually mean nothing, but collectively?" She pulled out another map, this one marked with red ink showing a pattern of acquisitions that formed a noose around his water sources. "They're building a stranglehold on your tenant farm's water supply." Alex stared at the maps, feeling cold fury settle in his stomach. "They're going to force me to buy them out, or let your tenants suffer crop failures, which would devastate your income and reputation." Nicole leaned back, her expression grim. "It's elegant, really. Nothing illegal, nothing you can challenge in court, just a slow, methodical acquisition of leverage. By this time next year, they'll have enough control to demand whatever price they want, or simply refuse to sell, watching your holdings deteriorate while they wait for you to become desperate enough to accept their terms. Which would be, at a guess, some portion of your political influence. Vane wants a voice in Parliament, wants social legitimacy he can't buy through normal channels. This is how he gets it, by making himself so essential to your survival that you have no choice but to support whatever ambitions he harbors."
Alex stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The forged deed had been crude, obvious, meant to be discovered and stopped, a distraction. But this was surgical, patient, the kind of long-game strategy that took years to execute and was nearly impossible to counter once it was already in motion. "How did you find this?" he asked, turning back to face her. "Your previous solicitor's files are remarkably comprehensive if disorganized. I've been cataloging property transactions in the north, looking for patterns."
Nicole gathered the documents with careful hands. When I saw Caro's purchase, something felt wrong. Men don't buy worthless land for twice its value unless someone else is paying them to do it. So I started looking at his finances, his associations, his recent correspondence. It led to Vane. In less than 2 weeks, you've uncovered a conspiracy that my solicitor of 10 years missed entirely. Your solicitor of 10 years wasn't looking for one. She met his gaze steadily, and he didn't have personal motivation to ensure that Lord Vane failed in his ambitions. Alex studied her in the firelight, this woman who'd blackmailed her way into his household, who'd refused his money and his attempts to be rid of her, who was now sitting in his library at midnight, presenting evidence of a threat he hadn't even known existed. "Can we stop it?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Nicole stood, moving to stand beside him near the fire. "But not through legal channels. They've been too careful for that. We need to outmaneuver them the same way they're outmaneuvering you, by buying properties before they can, by identifying their next targets and cutting them off at the knees. It will take capital, speed, and absolute discretion, all of which I have. Then we have a chance." She turned to face him fully, and in the firelight she looked different somehow, less like an interloper and more like what she'd claimed to be, an advisor, an ally. "But, Your Grace, you need to understand something. This is just the opening move. Vane isn't going to stop with water rights. He wants to destroy you, and he's willing to spend years doing it. If you want to survive what's coming, you're going to need someone who thinks the way he does, who can anticipate his strategies and counter them before they take root. Someone like you. Someone exactly like me." There was no false modesty in her voice, no attempt to soften the arrogance of the claim. "I may have blackmailed my way into this position, Your Grace, but what I'm offering you now is real value, the kind that can't be purchased with gold or intimidated into submission. I'm offering you the one thing Lord Vane didn't count on, someone who's smarter than he is and has more to lose." Alex looked at her for a long moment, weighing his options. His pride demanded that he reject her, that he find some way to handle this himself, but his pragmatism, the quality that had kept the Halton estate prosperous when other noble houses were crumbling, recognized the truth when it was presented to him. He needed her. Not because she'd forced her way into his life, but because she was genuinely, undeniably brilliant. And in the war that was apparently being waged against him, brilliance was a weapon he couldn't afford to refuse. "What do we do first?" he asked. Nicole smiled, and for the first time since she'd entered his life, it was a smile without edges, a smile that suggested they might actually be on the same side. "We start buying property, and we make sure Lord Vane knows that the game has changed." She returned to the table, already pulling out fresh maps and making notes about which properties to target first. Alex watched her work for a moment, then found himself moving to sit across from her, accepting the documents she handed him, listening as she outlined a strategy that was as ruthless as it was comprehensive. They worked till dawn, the fire burning low, the lamp sputtering as oil ran thin. And somewhere in those quiet hours, the dynamic between them shifted in a way neither of them fully acknowledged. She was no longer just his blackmailer, and he was no longer simply her captive. They were becoming something more dangerous. Partners.
The dinner party was a calculated risk, and Nicole had known it from the moment Alex informed her that Lord Vane had accepted his invitation. "He'll come to assess the situation," Alex had said 3 days prior, his voice tight with controlled tension. "He'll want to see you for himself, to understand what went wrong with his forgery scheme." "Then let him come," Nicole had replied with more confidence than she felt. "We need to establish your cousin's legitimacy before he has time to investigate too thoroughly." Now, standing in the drawing-room wearing a borrowed gown of deep burgundy silk that belonged to Alex's late mother, Nicole was beginning to question the wisdom of that bravado.
The gown fit reasonably well. The late Duchess had been slender, though taller than Nicole, but she felt like an impostor playing at being someone she wasn't, which, she supposed, was exactly what she was. The other guests had already arrived. Lady Pemberton and her husband, the magistrate, Lord and Lady Ashford, whose good opinion apparently mattered for reasons of political alliance, a handful of lesser nobility whose names Nicole had memorized, but whose faces all seemed to blur together in a sea of expensive fabric and inherited superiority. And then there was Lord Vane. He arrived exactly 15 minutes late, fashionably tardy, making an entrance. Nicole felt him before she saw him, a disturbance in the room's atmosphere, like a cold draught seeping under a door. When he finally appeared in the doorway, she understood why Alex despised him so viscerally. Lord Vane was handsome in the way poisonous things often were: sharp features, calculating eyes, a smile that never quite reached beyond the surface. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with silver threading through dark hair that had been styled with deliberate casualness. Wealth draped him like a second skin, from his perfectly cut evening coat to the signet ring that caught the lamplight as he moved. "Houghton," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "how good of you to include me in your gathering. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten our friendship." "Lord Vane." Alex's tone could freeze water. "So pleased you could attend. May I introduce my cousin, Miss Nicole Brooks? She's recently returned from abroad and has been kind enough to assist me with some estate matters." Nicole felt every eye in the room turn toward her. This was the moment, the story they'd rehearsed, the background they'd fabricated over late-night strategy sessions. She straightened her spine and smiled with exactly the right mixture of warmth and reserve. "Lord Vane, I've heard a great deal about you." "Have you?" Vane moved toward her with predatory grace, taking her hand and bowing over it. His fingers were cold. "How curious. I've heard absolutely nothing about you, which is strange considering Houghton and I travel in the same circles. I wasn't aware he had any cousins on his mother's side." The challenge hung in the air like a blade. Around them, the other guests shifted uncomfortably. Alex's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My mother's family wasn't inclined to London society," Nicole said smoothly, extracting her hand from his grip. "I spent most of my youth on the continent, France primarily, then Switzerland after the war." "Ah, the continent. How convenient. And what brings you back to England now, after so long away?" "Family duty. My cousin required assistance with some complex legal matters, and I found myself uniquely positioned to help."
Legal matters. Vane's eyes gleamed with something predatory. How fascinating. Tell me, Miss Brooks, where did you study law? Oxford doesn't admit women, and Cambridge is similarly restrictive. I had private tutors. Nicole felt sweat beginning to prickle at the base of her spine, despite the room's comfortable temperature. My late father believed women should be educated alongside men, a radical notion, but one he pursued with dedication. Your late father, and his name was? Thomas Brooks. The lie came easily. They'd prepared for this. He passed 5 years ago, quietly, not the sort of man who attracted notice. Clearly. Vane accepted a glass of wine from a passing servant, his gaze never leaving Nicole's face. "And yet here you are, his daughter, advising a duke on matters that would challenge some of London's finest legal minds. Quite a remarkable achievement for someone with such an unverifiable background." The room had gone absolutely silent. Nicole could feel Alex tensing beside her, could sense Lady Pemberton's avid curiosity and Lord Ashford's growing discomfort. This was the test. If she faltered now, if she showed even a moment of uncertainty, Vane would tear apart her entire fabricated history like a wolf scenting blood. Remarkable, perhaps,
Nicole said, her voice cool and steady despite her hammering heart. "But I find that intelligence is rarely restricted by gender, only by opportunity. My father provided opportunity. My cousin is enlightened enough to recognize competence regardless of its source. If you find that remarkable, Lord Vane, then perhaps you should examine your own assumptions about what women are capable of achieving." A sharp intake of breath from Lady Pemberton. Lord Ashford coughed into his wine, and Alex's hand moved almost imperceptibly to rest at the small of Nicole's back, a gesture of support that only she could feel. Vane's smile didn't waver, but something dark flickered in his eyes. "Spirited," he said softly. "How refreshing. Though I do wonder, Miss Brooks, whether all that spirit will be sufficient when your cousin's enemies come calling, and they will come calling. Some battles require more than intelligence and opportunity." "Then it's fortunate," Nicole replied, meeting his gaze directly, "that I've never limited myself to fighting only the battles I'm assured of winning." For a long moment they simply stared at each other across the drawing-room, a test of wills that had nothing to do with social pleasantries and everything to do with the war being waged beneath London's civilized surface. Finally, Vane turned away, addressing Alex with false cordiality. "You've acquired quite an interesting addition to your household, Houghton. I do hope she proves worth the investment." "I have no doubt of it," Alex said coldly. Dinner was announced, breaking the tension. As the guests filed toward the dining room, Nicole felt her hands trembling slightly. She'd survived the first assault, but Vane's suspicions were now firmly aroused. He didn't believe her story, that much was clear. He would investigate, would dig into her background, would try to prove she was exactly what she actually was, an impostor who'd blackmailed her way into the Duke's household. "You handled that well," Alex murmured as they followed the others, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "He doesn't believe a word of it." "No, but you didn't give him anything he could use, not yet." "Not yet," Nicole agreed quietly, watching Vane's back as he disappeared through the dining room doorway. "But he'll keep looking, and eventually he'll find something." "Then we'll be ready when he does." Nicole wished she shared his confidence, but as she took her seat at the dinner table, positioned directly across from Lord Vane, where she could feel his calculating gaze throughout the meal, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made herself visible to the one person who would stop at nothing to destroy her. The shadow of Lord Vane had fallen across her carefully constructed facade, and Nicole had the terrible suspicion that it would take more than intelligence and fabricated backgrounds to survive what was coming. Across the table, Vane raised his wineglass in a mock toast, his smile cold and knowing. The war had begun in earnest, and Nicole was no longer certain she could win. The evening had devolved into music and dancing, which Nicole had not anticipated and certainly had not prepared for. After dinner, the guests had migrated to the ballroom, a space she hadn't even known existed in Houghton House until tonight. It was smaller than the grand ballrooms she'd glimpsed through windows while delivering legal documents to other noble houses, but still achingly beautiful. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished floors, and someone had hired musicians who played with the kind of practiced elegance that money could buy. Nicole stood near the wall, trying to make herself invisible, while Lord Vane held court near the refreshment table, regaling Lady Pemberton with some story that had her laughing behind her fan. He kept glancing in Nicole's direction, his gaze sharp and assessing. Watching, always watching. "You're lurking," Alex said quietly, appearing beside her so suddenly she nearly startled. "It's making you look guilty." "I don't dance," Nicole replied, her voice low. "I never learned. It wasn't exactly part of a clerk's education." "Yes, well, a distant cousin raised on the continent by an eccentric father absolutely would have learned." Alex held out his hand, his expression neutral, but his eyes conveying urgency. Lord Vane is still watching you. If you refuse to dance, he'll wonder why a gentlewoman would lack such basic social graces." Nicole looked at his outstretched hand like it might bite her. "I'll embarrass us both." "You won't." Something in his voice made her look up. "Trust me, just this once." The word trust hung between them, weighted with irony. She'd blackmailed him. He'd tried to buy her off. They'd spent 3 weeks in a state of Cold War that had only recently thawed into something resembling partnership. Trust wasn't something they'd earned from each other. But Lord Vane was watching, and their fabricated story required this kind of easy familiarity between cousins. Nicole took his hand. Alex led her onto the floor just as a waltz began. His hand settled at her waist, warm through the silk of her borrowed gown, and Nicole felt suddenly acutely aware of how close they were standing. Closer than they'd ever been, except for that first morning when she'd invaded his study and upended his entire existence. "Follow my lead," he murmured. "Small steps, don't think too much. I'm a lawyer, not thinking is against my nature. Then pretend you're arguing a case, just let the logic of the movements guide you." It was absurd advice, but somehow it worked. Nicole focused on the pressure of his hand, the subtle shifts in his posture that telegraphed which direction they would turn. The music washed over them, and she found herself moving with him. Not gracefully, she'd never be graceful, but competently enough that they didn't collide with the other couples spinning across the floor. "You're a better student than you claim," Alex said, after they'd completed their first full turn around the room. "I'm motivated not to humiliate myself in front of Vane." "Is that the only motivation?" Nicole looked up sharply, but his expression was unreadable. They turned again, and she caught a glimpse of Lord Vane still watching them, his face thoughtful, calculating. "He's trying to find inconsistencies in our story," said Nicole quietly. "I know, which is why you need to smile." "Excuse me?" "Smile," Alex repeated, his own expression softening in a way that looked almost genuine. "We're supposed to be family. Distant family, yes, but fond of each other. Right now you look like you're being held hostage." "I am being held hostage by circumstance and necessity and a dance I don't know how to perform." "Then improvise." His hand tightened slightly at her waist, steadying her as they navigated a more complex turn. "You improvised your way into my household. Surely you can improvise your way through a waltz."
Nicole found herself almost smiling despite herself. There was something darkly amusing about the situation, the two of them locked in this performance, pretending to be something they weren't, while the man who wanted to destroy them both looked on. It was absurd. It was dangerous. It was intoxicating. "That's better," said Alex softly, and Nicole realized her expression had shifted into something that might actually pass for contentment. "See, you're a natural at deception." "Is that a compliment or an insult?" "With you, I'm no longer certain there's a difference." They danced in silence for a moment, the music swelling around them. Nicole was becoming more confident now, anticipating his movements, letting herself relax into the rhythm. It was like chess, she realized, a series of moves and counter-moves, each one building on the last. "When this is over," Alex said suddenly, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "when Vane's threat is neutralized and your position is secure, what then?" "What do you mean? Will you stay, or will you take what you've gained and move on to your next conquest?" Nicole looked up at him, genuinely surprised by the question. In the candlelight, his features had lost some of their usual severity. He looked younger, more vulnerable somehow. Or perhaps that was just the intimacy of the dance creating illusions. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead." Liar. But there was no heat in the accusation. "You've thought through every possible outcome. It's who you are." She wasn't wrong. Nicole had spent countless hours considering exit strategies, contingency plans, ways to leverage her position into something more permanent. But she hadn't expected him to notice, hadn't expected him to care. "And what about you, Your Grace?" She kept her voice light, conversational. "When this is over, will you finally find a way to break our contract and send me away?" 3 weeks ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. And now? Alex was quiet for a long moment, guiding them through another turn. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something Nicole couldn't quite identify. "Now I find myself wondering what Houghton House would be like without you in it. Quieter, certainly, more orderly, but also—" he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully—"less interesting."
Nicole's breath caught. It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't even particularly flattering, but coming from Alex Houghton, a man who'd spent weeks trying to rid himself of her, it felt like something significant, an acknowledgement that she'd become more than just an inconvenience he was forced to tolerate. "Careful, Your Grace," she said softly. "That almost sounded like you were starting to like me." "Don't mistake pragmatism for affection, Miss Brooks. You're useful. That doesn't make us friends." Of course not. But Nicole could feel the lie in the way his hand rested at her waist, steady and sure, in the way he'd taught her to dance rather than letting her fail publicly, in the way he'd said less interesting instead of less problematic. The music was winding down, their waltz would end soon, and they would return to being what they'd always been, two people bound together by necessity and mutual blackmail, playing roles for an audience that wanted nothing more than to see them fail. But for this moment, spinning across the ballroom floor with crystal light catching in the chandeliers above them, Nicole let herself imagine something different, a version of this story where she hadn't forced her way into his life, where he'd chosen to let her stay, where the lines between captor and captive, between blackmailer and victim, between adversaries and allies had blurred into something neither of them could quite define. The final notes of the waltz faded. Alex stepped back, releasing her with the formal distance appropriate for cousins, but his eyes held hers for a beat longer than necessary. "Thank you for the dance, cousin," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom for Vane's benefit. "The pleasure was mine, Your Grace," Nicole replied, executing a small curtsy that felt only slightly ridiculous. As Alex escorted her back to the edge of the floor, Nicole caught Lord Vane's expression. He was still watching, still calculating, but there was something else there now, a flicker of uncertainty. He'd seen them dance together with the easy familiarity of family, had seen Nicole hold her own in aristocratic company, had found no obvious cracks in their fabricated story. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was survival. And as Nicole accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant, she allowed herself the smallest smile. They'd passed another test, fooled another audience, blurred another line. She'd come to Houghton House to secure power. She hadn't expected to find partnership, or the dangerous possibility that partnership might become something more.
The man's name was Edmund Thorne, and Nicole recognized him the moment Graves announced his arrival in the entrance hall. She'd been reviewing contracts in her makeshift office when she heard the commotion, raised voices, Graves' insistent tone suggesting the visitor was unwelcome. Something in the timbre of the unfamiliar voice made her blood run cold. She set down her pen and moved to the doorway, peering down the corridor toward the entrance. And there he was, older than she remembered, his hair graying at the temples and his waistcoat straining against a prosperous middle-age spread, but unmistakably Edmund Thorne, senior clerk at Pemberton and Associates, the firm where she'd spent 5 years copying documents and fetching tea and being invisible. The firm where she'd been nobody. "I must speak with the Duke immediately," Thorne was saying, his voice carrying an edge of self-importance. "It's a matter of utmost urgency regarding the woman claiming to be his cousin." Nicole's heart stopped. She pulled back from the doorway, her mind racing through possibilities. Thorne had seen her at the dinner party. She'd noticed him briefly in passing, but had assumed he wouldn't recognize her. She'd been wrong, catastrophically wrong. "Your Grace is occupied,"
Graves replied with icy politeness. "If you'd care to leave your card—" "No card. I'll wait." Thorne planted himself on a bench near the door. "Tell Houghton that I have information about Miss Nicole Brooks, information that will be of considerable interest to him and to Lord Vane." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Nicole stood frozen in the corridor, her borrowed respectability disintegrating with every second Thorne remained in the house. He knew who she really was, knew where she'd come from, could expose her entire fabricated history with a single conversation. She had to run, had to gather what little she owned and disappear into London before— Miss Brooks. She turned to find Alex standing behind her, his expression unreadable. How long had he been there? Had he heard? "My study," he said quietly. "Now." Alex closed the study door behind them with deliberate care. Nicole stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. This was it, the end of everything she'd built. He would throw her out, or worse, hand her over to Vane's justice. "Who is he?" Alex asked, moving to stand behind his desk, the same position he'd held that first morning when she'd invaded his life with stolen evidence and blackmail. "Edmund Thorne. He was the senior clerk at Pemberton and Associates, the firm where I worked before I came here." "You worked for him?" "Under him, yes. I was a copying clerk, the lowest position in the office." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "He knows exactly what I am, Your Grace, and he's going to tell you, and then he's going to tell Vane, and your fabricated cousin will be exposed as nothing more than a criminal who blackmailed her way into your household." Alex was silent for a long moment, his expression carved from ice. "What does he want?" "I don't know. Money, probably, or perhaps Vane sent him. Perhaps this was the plan all along, dig into my background until they found someone who could shatter the lie." "Sit down." "Your Grace, sit down." It wasn't a request. Nicole sat, feeling like a prisoner awaiting sentence. Alex remained standing, studying her with that penetrating gaze that had made her uncomfortable from the beginning. He was calculating something, weighing options she couldn't see. "Tell me the truth, all of it. No more fabrications, no more clever deflections. Who are you really, Nicole Brooks?" The use of her first name, the first time he'd ever spoken it, felt strangely intimate. Nicole took a shaky breath. "I'm exactly what Thorne will tell you I am, a clerk's daughter who worked in a legal office for 5 years, copying other men's work and watching them take credit for insights I provided. I have no education beyond what I taught myself, no family connections, no right to be here at all." I looked down at her hands. "I stumbled onto Vane's conspiracy by accident, and I used it to force my way into a life I had no business claiming." "Why?"
"Because I was tired of being invisible, tired of being nothing." The words came out raw, honest in a way she hadn't intended. "I wanted power, real power, the kind that comes from being indispensable to someone who actually matters in this world." "And you didn't care that you were building it all on lies?" "No," Nicole admitted. "I didn't care. I still don't. These past weeks, working on your estate, using my skills for something more than copying briefs, this is the first time my life has felt like it meant anything." Alex turned away, staring out the window at the gardens below. Nicole waited, her chest tight with anticipation. This was where he would tell her to leave, where he would summon Thorne and allow him to destroy her completely. "What would you do?" Alex asked quietly, "if you were in my position?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" "You're brilliant at strategy, at seeing several moves ahead." He turned back to face her. "So tell me, if you were the Duke and you'd just discovered that your legal advisor was a fraud who'd manipulated her way into your household, what would you do?" Nicole stared at him, trying to understand what he was asking. I would cut my losses, expose the fraud before she could do more damage."
That's what my father would have done, what any sensible aristocrat would do. Alex moved to lean against his desk, his arms crossed. But my father also employed a solicitor who missed Lord Vane's conspiracy for 10 years, a solicitor with impeccable credentials and absolutely no imagination. Your Grace, I don't understand. You found Vane's plot in 2 weeks, Nicole. You've identified problems in my estate management that have existed for years. You've proven yourself more valuable than any legitimately educated barrister I could hire. He paused. The question isn't whether you have the proper background. The question is whether I can afford to lose you. Nicole felt something crack open in her chest. You're saying... I'm saying that Edmund Thorne is about to have a very enlightening conversation, one where I explain that Miss Nicole Brooks is indeed my cousin, that her employment history at Pemberton and Associates was part of her eccentric education, and that any suggestion otherwise would be considered slander against the Houghton family name. He won't believe that. He doesn't have to believe it. He just has to decide whether contradicting a duke is worth whatever Lord Vane is paying him. Alex moved toward the door. Wait here. Alex! His name escaped before she could stop it, without the title, without the formal distance they'd maintained. He paused, looking back at her. Why? She asked simply. For a moment, something unguarded crossed his face. Because you were right that first morning. You are the only person standing between me and Lord Vane's ambitions. And because somewhere in the past few weeks I've stopped seeing you as the woman who blackmailed me, and started seeing you as... He trailed off, seeming to search for the right word. As what? As someone I would choose to have at my side, even without the blackmail. He opened the door. Stay here. And Nicole, no more lies between us. Whatever this is, it works better when we're honest with each other. He left before she could respond. Nicole sat alone in the study, her heart pounding, listening to the murmur of voices from the entrance hall. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard Alex's tone, cold, authoritative, absolute, the voice of a man who expected to be obeyed. 10 minutes later, she heard the front door close. Footsteps retreated down the drive. Alex returned to the study, his expression grim but satisfied. Thorne has been reminded that his professional reputation depends on the goodwill of his clients who tend to trust the word of a duke over that of a disgruntled clerk with suspicious timing. He'll go to Vane. Probably, but without evidence it's just one man's word against mine, and I'm significantly more credible. Alex crossed to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to her. Besides, Vane already suspects you're not who you claim to be. This changes nothing, except that now we know he's actively investigating. Nicole took the brandy, her hands still unsteady. You risked your reputation for me. I protected an asset, one I've come to value. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling between them. He'd chosen her. Despite knowing the truth, despite having every reason to cast her out, Alex Houghton had chosen to protect her. Thank you, Nicole said quietly. Don't thank me yet. Alex raised his glass in a mock toast. We still have to survive whatever Vane throws at us next. And he will throw something. He always does. Nicole touched her glass to his, the crystal chiming softly. Then we'll be ready. Together? She met his eyes and saw the question beneath the question. This was no longer about blackmail or necessity. This was a choice, his choice to keep her at his side. Together, she agreed, and for the first time since she'd forced her way into his life, Nicole Brooks felt like she might actually belong there.
The official letter arrived on a grey morning 3 days after Edmund Thorne's visit, delivered by a crown messenger with all the ceremony of an execution notice.
Nicole was in the library with Alex, reviewing the latest property acquisitions in their campaign against Vane's water rights scheme, when Graves appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested the apocalypse had arrived, wearing Her Majesty's seal. "Your Grace," he said, his voice unusually strained, "a communication from the Lord Chancellor's office." Alex took the letter, his face carefully neutral as he broke the seal. Nicole watched his jaw tighten as he read, watched the muscle jump in his temple that she'd learned meant he was containing fury through sheer force of will. "What is it?" she asked, though dread was already pooling in her stomach. "A legal audit." He handed her the letter, his voice cold and clipped. "The Lord Chancellor, at the request of concerned parties, has ordered a comprehensive review of the Houghton estate's legal affairs. They're sending a team of auditors tomorrow." Nicole scanned the document, her legal training automatically passing the formal language for hidden threats. "Concerned parties," she repeated. "Vane." "Obviously." Alex stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "He's escalating. Fawn's testimony wasn't enough to destroy you outright, so now he's bringing in official channels. If the auditors find any irregularities in our affairs, any contracts you've drafted that contain errors, any documents that suggest you lack proper legal training, they'll have grounds to investigate my credentials," Nicole finished, "and when they discover I have none, they'll arrest me for fraud and practicing law without authorization, and you for knowingly employing an impostor in legal matters." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Nicole's mind was already racing through their options, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. They couldn't refuse the audit. That would only confirm suspicions. They couldn't hide the work she'd done. Months of contract bore her influence, her strategy, her unmistakable legal reasoning. "How many contracts have you drafted or revised?" Alex asked quietly. 47. Nicole set down the letter with hands that wanted to tremble. "Plus the property acquisitions, the water rights negotiations, the correspondence with 3 different barristers. My fingerprints are all over your estate's legal affairs. And all of it is brilliant work, work that any trained solicitor would be proud to claim. But I'm not a trained solicitor. I'm a clerk who read law books by candlelight and learned through observation." She met his eyes. "Alex, if they bring in experts, real legal scholars who examine those contracts, they'll see patterns, self-taught patterns, techniques that no proper barrister would use because they were never formally instructed in the orthodox methods. You think they'll identify your work as amateur? I think they'll identify it as irregular, and irregular in this context means fraudulent." Nicole moved to the desk, pulling out the files she'd been working on. "We need to prepare. If I'm going to survive this audit, I need to be able to defend every legal decision I've made with formal precedent and established doctrine. You have 1 day. I'm aware." Alex watched her for a moment, something complicated working behind his eyes. "You could run." Nicole looked up sharply. "What?" "You could leave tonight. I'd give you money, references under a different name. You could disappear into the continent before the auditors arrive." He leaned against the desk, his voice carefully neutral. "I would tell them you'd been called away on family business. It would buy you time." "And leave you to face the audit alone, to explain why your legal advisor vanished the night before Crown auditors arrived?" Nicole shook her head. "That would condemn you as surely as my staying would condemn us both." "Perhaps, but you'd be safe." The words hung between them, rated with implications Nicole didn't dare examine too closely. He was offering her an escape. After everything, after she'd blackmailed him, after weeks of forced partnership, after he'd defended her to Thorne, he was still giving her a way out. "No," she said firmly, "we face this together." "I'm not running." She pulled another file toward her, already making notes about which contracts would be most vulnerable to scrutiny. I didn't force my way into your life just to abandon you the moment things became dangerous. We fight this, we win this, or we fall together." Alex was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Are you certain?" "Absolutely not. I'm terrified." Nicole looked up at him, letting him see the fear she usually kept hidden. "But I'm also not leaving, so we'd better be extremely clever about how we survive tomorrow." They worked through the night. By dawn, the library looked like a legal battlefield, documents spread across every surface, law books stacked in precarious towers, Nicole's notes covering the desk in a web of citations and precedents. She'd reviewed every contract she'd drafted, every letter she'd written, every legal decision she'd made. Alex had worked beside her, his knowledge of estate law proving surprisingly comprehensive as they crafted defenses for each potential vulnerability. This one, Nicole held up a property contract from 6 weeks prior. The language in Clause 7 is unconventional. A trained barrister would have used the standard limitation terminology, but I wrote it to close a loophole I'd seen exploited at Pemberton and Associates. Is it legal? Yes, but it's creative. If they question it, you'll explain that you studied French law during your time abroad. French legal tradition allows for more flexibility in contractual language. It's unorthodox, but not improper. They'll want to test my knowledge. Then we'll spend the morning rehearsing. He poured them both more coffee from the pot that had been refreshed 3 times during the night. What are the key differences between English and French contract law? Nicole recited from memory, her mind sharp despite exhaustion. They'd prepared for this. She knew the continental legal systems as well as she knew English law. Years of reading, of study, of building the education she'd been denied through formal channels. It would have to be enough. At 8 o'clock, Graves announced the arrival of the audit team, 3 men, all wearing the severe black coats of legal officials, led by a senior examiner named Whitmore, whose eyes held the kind of cold assessment that missed nothing. "Your Grace," Whitmore bowed with minimal courtesy, "I appreciate your cooperation in this matter. I trust you've prepared all relevant documentation for our review?" "Everything you require." Alex's voice was pure aristocratic ice. "My legal advisor, Miss Brooks, has organized the materials. She'll be available to answer any questions about the estate's affairs." Whitmore's gaze shifted to Nicole, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical thing. "Miss Brooks, how convenient that you're present. I have quite a few questions about your credentials." "I'm at your service," Nicole replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The trap had been set. The auditors had arrived with vain suspicions and Crown authority, and Nicole Brooks, a clerk pretending to be a legal advisor, was about to defend her right to exist in a world that had never wanted her in the first place. "Shall we begin?" Whitmore asked, his smile cold and predatory. Alex's hand brushed Nicole's briefly, a gesture of support so subtle the auditors wouldn't notice, but she felt it like a promise. Together. "Yes," Nicole said, meeting Whitmore's gaze with steel in her own. "Let's begin." The battle for her survival, for their survival, had begun in earnest, and Nicole intended to win. The hearing took place in Alex's own library, which felt like a particular cruelty. The room where Nicole had spent countless nights mastering the intricacies of his estate was now transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Whitmore sat at the head of the table, flanked by his 2 fellow auditors. Lord Vane occupied a chair near the window, officially present as concerned citizen, but radiating satisfaction like a man watching his prey walk into a carefully constructed trap. Alex stood near the fireplace, forbidden from sitting at the table by protocol, but positioned where Nicole could see him. His face was a mask of ducal composure, but she caught the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the mantel edge. Nicole sat alone at the opposite end of the table, facing her inquisitors. Miss Brooks, Whitmore began, laying out a stack of contracts before him. We've spent the morning reviewing the legal work produced under your advisement. I must say it's quite extensive for someone who only recently arrived from the continent. I've been working diligently, Mr. Whitmore. His Grace's affairs required immediate attention. Indeed, Whitmore selected a document from the pile. The Chesterfield Tenant Agreement. You revised the original contract to include what you call a reciprocal maintenance clause. Can you explain the legal precedent for such language? Nicole's heart hammered, but her voice remained steady. The clause is derived from French contract law, specifically the principle of obligation réciproque, reciprocal obligations. During my time abroad, I studied under scholars who emphasized bilateral accountability in tenancy agreements. How convenient that you studied continental law, Vane's voice cut across the room like a blade, given that such education is nearly impossible to verify. My education is verified by my competence, Lord Vane. Nicole met his gaze directly. As evidenced by the fact that the Chesterfield contract you're examining has already been praised by the tenant's own solicitor as the fairest agreement he's reviewed in 20 years. Whitmore held up a hand, silencing Vane. Miss Brooks, let's move to the water rights acquisitions. You've orchestrated the purchase of 7 properties in 3 months. The legal complexity of these transactions is considerable. Where did you learn negotiation strategy of this sophistication? This was dangerous ground. Nicole had learned negotiation by watching barristers at Pemberton and Associates, by reading case files late at night, by teaching herself what the law schools would never teach her. But she couldn't say that. Strategy is not taught, Mr. Whitmore, it's practiced. She pulled a document toward her, one of Vane's own property acquisitions that she'd analyzed. For instance, this purchase by the Northern Waterworks Company. Brilliant strategy, acquiring properties not for their individual value, but for their collective leverage. I simply employed similar thinking on behalf of His Grace. Vane's expression darkened. She just compared her tactics to his, implying she'd learned from studying his own methods. It was risky, but it established her competence, while simultaneously reminding everyone in the room that Vane himself was engaged in the same aggressive property schemes he was now criticizing. "You presume to understand my business affairs?" Vane said coldly. "I presume to understand legal strategy, my lord. Your affairs are merely an example of competent execution." Nicole turned back to Whitmore. "Unless you're suggesting that legal brilliance is the exclusive province of men with university credentials." One of the other auditors coughed. Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition that she'd just accused them of potential bias. "No one is suggesting that, Miss Brooks." Whitmore selected another document. "However, there are concerns about the authenticity of your background. We have testimony from a Mr. Edmund Thorne suggesting you were employed as a mere clerk at Pemberton and Associates." There it was, the trap springing shut. Nicole felt every eye in the room fix on her. Alex's hand tightened on the mantel. Vane leaned forward, anticipating victory. "Mr. Thorne is correct," Nicole said calmly.
The room went silent. "I beg your pardon," Whitmore blinked. "I said Mr. Thorne is correct. I was employed at Pemberton and Associates as a clerk." Nicole stood, moving to pull a specific file from the shelf behind her, one she'd prepared specifically for this moment. "My father, Thomas Brooks, believed in practical education. He arranged for me to work in a legal office to understand the profession from its foundation. I spent 5 years learning every aspect of legal practice, from document preparation to court procedure to client management."
She laid the file on the table. It contained her actual work from Pemberton and Associates, documents she'd copied, yes, but annotated with her own notes, her own insights, evidence of the brilliance that had been invisible to everyone who'd employed her. While other young women of my station were learning embroidery, I was learning law. While they attended balls, I attended to briefs. My education was unconventional, gentlemen, but it was thorough. And frankly, working from the bottom of a legal office taught me more about actual practice than any university could provide. Whitmore examined the documents, his expression thoughtful. These annotations, they're yours. Every one. I wasn't content to simply copy contracts. I analyzed them, found their weaknesses, imagined how they could be improved. Mr. Pemberton never knew. I was just a clerk, after all, beneath notice. But I was learning. Nicole looked directly at Vane. And when the opportunity arose to put that learning into practice, I seized it. The opportunity being your employment with the Duke, Whitmore said carefully. The opportunity being His Grace's recognition that competence matters more than credentials. Nicole returned to her seat. I came to him with evidence of a threat to his estate, the forged land deed that would have subjected him to false treason charges. I prevented a miscarriage of justice. In gratitude, he gave me a chance to prove my worth. Everything I've done since has validated that decision. Or it proves you're a skilled manipulator, a clerk who stumbled onto sensitive information and blackmailed her way into a position she had no right to claim, Vane interjected. Blackmail, an interesting accusation, Lord Vane. Tell me, is it blackmail to warn someone their life is in danger? Is it manipulation to offer one's skills in service of preventing disaster? It is when you extract compensation for it. I extracted employment based on demonstrated competence. His Grace has paid me for legal work I've performed brilliantly, work that has saved his estate tens of thousands of pounds and protected him from schemes, she paused meaningfully, orchestrated by those who wish him harm. The implication was clear. She'd just accused Vane of being behind those schemes, publicly, in front of Crown auditors. Vane stood abruptly, his composure cracking. This is absurd. This woman is a fraud, and you're allowing her to— Lord Vane, Whitmore's voice cut like steel, please restrain yourself. This is an official audit, not a personal vendetta. The words landed like blows. Whitmore had just acknowledged what everyone in the room understood. Vane's involvement was personal, not procedural. Nicole seized the opening. Gentlemen, I understand your skepticism. My background is unconventional, but unconventional doesn't mean incompetent. Every contract I've drafted is legally sound. Every strategy I've employed has been effective. Every decision I've made has served His Grace's interests with integrity and skill. She paused, gathering her courage for the final gambit. If you find any actual legal error in my work, any contract that fails to meet professional standards, then by all means charge me with fraud. But if my work is sound, then what you're really questioning is whether a woman has the right to be brilliant without a university's permission.
Silence fell across the library. The auditors exchanged glances. Alex remained motionless by the fireplace, barely breathing. Finally, Whitmore spoke. Miss Brooks, your work is unconventional, but I see no legal errors, no grounds for charges of fraud or malpractice. He looked at Vane. Unless Lord Vane has evidence beyond hearsay and personal suspicion. Vane's face was rigid with barely controlled fury. This isn't over. Actually, Whitmore said mildly, I believe it is, unless you'd like to explain to the Lord Chancellor why you orchestrated an expensive audit based on personal animosity rather than legitimate legal concerns. Vane stood in frozen silence for a long moment.
Then he turned and left without another word, his exit more eloquent than any threat he could have spoken. Whitmore began gathering his documents. "Your Grace, Miss Brooks, thank you for your cooperation. Our report will reflect that your estate's legal affairs are in excellent order." He paused at the door. "Miss Brooks, you should consider applying to one of the Inns of Court. With a formal credential, your work could open doors beyond estate management." When the auditors had left, Nicole remained seated, her hands finally beginning to tremble with released tension. They'd survived. She'd survived. Alex crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "I was terrified. You were brilliant." His eyes held hers, intense and unguarded. "You risked everything, admitted your background, challenged Vane directly, all to protect my reputation." "Our reputation," Nicole corrected. "We're bound together now. Your fate is mine." "Is it?" Alex's voice was low, rough with emotion she'd never heard from him before. "Is that all this is? Bound fates and mutual survival?" Nicole looked up at him, at this man who'd defended her to Thorne, who'd stood by her through the audit, who'd offered her escape and respected her refusal. The lines between captor and captive, between adversary and ally, between partnership and something far more dangerous had blurred beyond recognition. "No," she whispered, "it's not all this is." And when Alex kissed her, fierce and desperate and full of relief and triumph and something that felt terrifyingly like love, Nicole kissed him back without hesitation. They'd survived the trap together. Now they would face whatever came next the same way. Nicole stood in her chambers 3 days after the hearing, surrounded by the half-packed belongings that represented her brief tenure at Houghton House. The trunk lay open on the bed, her modest collection of borrowed gowns folded beside it. The desk where she'd drafted contracts and plotted strategies was cleared of papers, leaving only the polished wood surface reflecting the afternoon light. She'd won. They'd won. Vane had been forced to retreat, his conspiracy exposed, his audit turned against him. The Crown's official report had praised the Houghton estate's legal management in terms that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to question her competence again. Which meant she no longer had any reason to stay. The original contract, the one she'd blackmailed Alex into signing, sat on the desk beside a sealed letter. She'd drafted the dissolution agreement herself, releasing both of them from obligations forged in desperation and maintained through necessity. It was fair, generous even, a full year's salary, glowing references, and Alex's continued protection of her fabricated background. Everything she'd forced her way into his life to secure. And yet, the thought of walking out of Houghton House felt like tearing something vital from her chest. "You're really leaving?" Nicole turned to find Alex standing in the doorway, still wearing the formal coat he'd donned for meetings in town. He looked exhausted, the past weeks of tension finally showing in the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. "The audit is complete. Your estate is secure. Vane has been neutralized." Nicole gestured at the contract on the desk. "Our arrangement has fulfilled its purpose." "Our arrangement?" Alex stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Is that what we're calling it?" "What would you call it?" "I don't know any more." He picked up the dissolution agreement, scanning it with the quick efficiency of someone trained to parse legal documents. "This is remarkably generous, more than fair." "You saved my life at that hearing. You could have thrown me to Vane's mercy, could have claimed ignorance of my background. Instead, you stood by me." Nicole folded another gown, keeping her hands busy so she wouldn't have to meet his eyes. "I wanted to ensure you were properly compensated for that loyalty." "Compensated?" Alex set down the agreement with deliberate care. "Nicole, look at me." She did, and immediately regretted it. His expression was raw in a way she'd never seen. No aristocratic mask, no carefully maintained composure. Just Alex Houghton looking at her like she was about to make the worst mistake of both their lives. "You're really leaving?" "Yes, I do. The contract that bound us. To hell with the contract." The vehemence in his voice stopped her mid-sentence. "That piece of paper was signed under duress, built on blackmail and desperation. It has nothing to do with why I want you to stay now."
Nicole's heart began to hammer against her ribs. "Alex, when you walked into my study that first morning, you were right. I did need you. I needed your brilliance, your strategy, your complete lack of deference to my title." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the pulse jumping in his throat. But somewhere between that moment and this one, need became something else entirely. "We were partners, allies against a common enemy." "We were more than that, and you know it." Alex reached out, his fingers catching hers, stilling her nervous folding. "The night in the library, the dance at the dinner party, the way you refused to run when Thorne threatened to expose you, every moment we've spent planning strategy or arguing over contracts or simply existing in the same space, none of that was just partnership, Nicole." She wanted to argue, to maintain the safe distance of professional boundaries, but she couldn't lie to him, not anymore, not after he'd chosen to protect her, knowing the full truth of what she was. "Then what was it?" she whispered. "This." Alex pulled a document from his coat pocket, not the dissolution agreement, but something else entirely. Fresh parchment, covered in his distinctive handwriting. "A new contract, if you'll consider it." Nicole took it with trembling hands, her legal training automatically passing the formal language. But this wasn't like any contract she'd ever reviewed. There were no clauses about compensation or duration of employment. Instead, she found herself reading, "Let it be known that Alex Houghton, Duke of Houghton, hereby offers to Nicole Brooks a partnership of equals, built not on coercion, but on mutual respect, shared ambition, and a recognition that brilliance deserves opportunity, regardless of its origin. The terms of this partnership include joint management of the Houghton estates, shared decision-making authority in all legal and financial matters, equal standing in society through the bond of marriage. This contract may only be dissolved by mutual consent of both parties and remains in effect for the duration of their natural lives, renewable through commitment, trust, and love freely given." Nicole's vision blurred. She read it again, certain she'd misunderstood, but the words remained the same. Marriage, partnership, equals. "You're asking me to marry me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm asking you to stay, not as my employee, not as my blackmailer, not even as just my legal advisor." Alex took the contract from her hands and set it aside, then gently cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I'm asking you to stay as my wife, my partner, my equal in everything that matters, to build something real together, something that doesn't need blackmail or desperation to sustain it." "I forced my way into your life. I'm a clerk pretending to be something I'm not. I have no family, no dowry, no right to—" "You have every right." Alex's voice was fierce. "You're the most brilliant person I've ever met. You saved my estate, my reputation, possibly my life. You've worked harder in 3 months than most people work in years. You deserve everything you've claimed and more." "The society that destroyed me at that hearing will never accept." "Society can go to hell." He kissed her then, soft and devastating. "Now I can't imagine my life without you in it. That library, that desk, these chambers feel empty when you're not here. And I realized something during that hearing, watching you outmaneuver Vane with nothing but your wit and courage." "What?"
I realized I don't want a wife who knows her place. I want a wife who takes places she was never offered. I want someone who argues with me, who challenges me, who sees me as Alex instead of the Duke. I want you, Nicole, not because of who you really are, but because of it. Nicole felt tears threatening, something she'd trained herself never to do. I don't know how to be a duchess. Good. I don't want a duchess. I want you. He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. We'll figure out the rest together. We are rather good at that, in case you hadn't noticed. She laughed, the sound watery but genuine. We are, aren't we? So? He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, and there was vulnerability there that made her chest ache. Will you sign my contract, Miss Brooks? Will you stay, not because you have to, but because you choose to?
Nicole looked at the contract on the desk, the new one, the one that offered everything she'd never dared to want. Partnership, respect, love, a life built on choice rather than coercion. There's a clause missing, she said. Alex's expression flickered with uncertainty. What? The part where I love you back. Nicole reached for a pen, making a notation on the contract with the kind of precision she'd brought to every legal document she'd ever drafted. There, now it's complete. She'd written, Nicole Brooks accepts these terms with the understanding that her partnership with Alex Houghton is founded not merely on mutual respect and shared ambition, but on love freely given and gratefully received. She chooses this bond not from necessity, but from the certainty that they are better together than apart. Alex read it, and when he looked up, his smile was the most genuine thing she'd ever seen on his face. You really are annoyingly good at contracts, he said. Someone has to be. Nicole set down the pen. Though I should warn you, I'm going to argue with you about every estate decision. I'm going to question your judgment regularly. I'm going to be impossible. I'm counting on it. Alex kissed her again, deeper this time, full of promise and relief, and the kind of joy that came from finding something you hadn't known you were searching for. After all, what's the point of having a brilliant wife if she just agrees with everything I say? No point at all, Nicole agreed. They signed the contract together, their signatures side by side, no longer captor and captive, no longer blackmailer and victim, but partners in the truest sense. Two people who'd found each other through extraordinary circumstances and chosen to stay through something far simpler, love. Outside the window, London continued its restless motion. Lord Vane was somewhere in that city, plotting his next move. The society that had tried to destroy Nicole would whisper about the Duke's shopping marriage to his cousin. There would be challenges ahead, battles to fight, prejudices to overcome. But standing in her chambers, their chambers now, with Alex's arms around her and their futures newly intertwined, Nicole Brooks felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt like she'd come home. So, Alex said, his voice warm with amusement, what do we do first, my brilliant wife-to-be? Nicole smiled, already reaching for her portfolio of estate documents. We finish what we started. We destroy Lord Vane's water rights scheme completely. And then, she looked up at him, her eyes bright with the kind of ambition that would never be satisfied. We show London exactly what a clerk-turned-duchess can accomplish when she's finally given the power she deserves. Terrifying, Alex said, but he was smiling. Absolutely terrifying. You wouldn't have me any other way. No, he agreed, kissing her one more time. I absolutely wouldn't. And in the library, where they'd spent so many nights planning, strategizing, and slowly falling in love, two signatures dried on a contract that needed no coercion to make it binding. Just choice, just partnership, just them.
If Nicole's fight reminded you that power isn't granted, it's seized, claimed through brilliant strategy, stubborn refusal to remain invisible, and the courage to rewrite rules that were never meant to include you, then this story was for you. Subscribe so you never miss a story about women who maneuvered their way into impossible spaces, partnerships forged in fire, and love that recognizes brilliance before credentials. You're the reason these stories exist. Thank you for being here.